Okay, Fareed, maybe we should get started here.
Sounds good.
Terrific. Well, first, I am so excited to have you with me and with all of us. I will tell you, based on the RSVPs, the entire organization is very excited to hear what you have to say. I have 10 lessons for a post-pandemic world by you in front of me. I think you need no introduction to this group, but most folks know you from CNN, Fareed, Zakaria, GPS, as a contributing editor to The Atlantic and obviously The Washington Post. If I could, I'd love to start up front with your epigraph and where you started, which I loved, with a Dickinson quote. I'm going to read, not the Dickinson quote, but a little later, about how the future never spoke. And then when I flip over the book onto the back flap, and this I will read a little bit, on CNN in 2017, you said, one of the biggest threats facing the United States isn't that big at all. Actually, it's a tiny microscopic, thousands of times smaller than the head of a pin. So I'm not calling you a prophet per se, and it does feel like much of the world missed this, our country in particular. How is it possible that in 2019, Johns Hopkins thought the US was the most prepared for a pandemic like this? We turn out to be one of the worst. How did we all collectively miss this pandemic?
First of all, thanks so much for having me, David. It's a huge pleasure. It's a great question. At one level, when I did that segment of the program, it didn't take that much prescience, sadly, to say what I said, because at that point, a number of scientists had been making this point. Bill Gates had made that famous warning that he made. And what occasioned it for me was that Trump was trying to cut funding for public health, for global public health at that very time. I think that the fundamental problem, if you want to look at it at a deeper structural level, which is, I think, the right way to look at it, is we are not very good at dealing with, kind of long tail events, once every 10-year events, things like that. The system is not geared for that. The system does not reward you. So look at what just happened in Texas. People make it out like this was some total freak occurrence. It wasn't. 10 years ago, you had a bad winter in Texas, and a commission was formed that said, you need to weatherize the power infrastructure because this is going to happen once every 10 years. Literally, that was the prediction of that commission. It isn't even the worst winter that Texas has had in 25 years. 89 was colder than this. So this is a case where the incentives for people in that industry and government and such is very short term. And to do something where you're buying insurance, and I'm using that as a metaphor, you're buying insurance every year for something that doesn't happen every year is very hard. So to put money into global public health, into pandemic preparedness, into climate change awareness, the problem is, by the third year, people are saying, excuse me, can I get that money back, from my budget? And it's that mentality that we have to change. And that's why, the first lesson of the book is really all about this. How do we understand resilience? How do we understand these longer term risks? And how do we build a system where we incentivize people to do that so that we don't every 5 years or 10 years have one of these events that is incredibly expensive. The three storms, the three hurricanes a year ago cost us $296 billion. But more worrying, with a pandemic or with climate change, it could be something so big that you can't kind of fix it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we were sort of saying up front, I really, I'm saying it because the book was fantastic. It was so broad in its scope, really addressing every aspect of our lives, from economics to politics to science to health to technology to government, yet it was very digestible, something I sat down and read and couldn't put it down until I finished. I'd love to kind of talk about a lot of different themes that you bring up, but it does feel to me that many of the trends that we were all living through, whether it was, big economic and social inequality, populism, anti-immigration, a lot of these trends probably were trends that didn't set us up so well as a globe, as a world, to deal with what was obviously a global pandemic. I would start with, government in particular. What have we learned in how governments, ours in particular, but governments around the world, responded to and dealt with this? I love, sort of the way you describe this is no longer a debate in the world about the quantity of government, but it's about the quality of government. Can you tell us all what you mean about that?
Sure. So if you think about it, we still tend to think about government and think about this issue in kind of Cold War 20th century terms, which is this government more like a socialist government or is this more like a capitalist government? You saw this in the debate during the presidential election when Bernie Sanders started talking about Denmark. And what I was struck by was both sides totally misunderstood Denmark. The left started praising it because they said, oh my God, Bernie Sanders likes a socialist country. The right started attacking it because they said, we don't want socialism. The truth is, we're sort of past that. 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, communism failed. There's no country that's really a communist country anymore, least of all the Communist Party of China, which is more capitalist than the United States in many ways. What we're in is a world in which everyone understands the market does some things fantastically and government has to do some things. And how do you get that balance right? And what does it mean? And what I was struck by was when you looked at the countries that did really well at handling the pandemic, they weren't uniformly democracies or dictatorships. Taiwan probably does the best. South Korea does superbly, but then so does Singapore, so does China, so does Vietnam. So there you have almost 5 different styles of government. What all of them had was a devotion to the idea that government agencies should be well-funded, staffed by technocrats, lean, responsive, and they had a certain kind of humility about always searching for best practices, something you in business understand instinctively, right? I mean, Bill Gates once said to me, for all my life at Microsoft, the 2 questions I asked myself whenever I confronted a problem were, who is doing this better or best, and what can I learn from him or her, right? That mentality worked fantastically. What didn't work was the sort of big, lumbering, arrogant attitude that largely characterized the US government. You asked, how did Johns Hopkins rate us number 1? It's very interesting. It's a good example of using the wrong measurement. Essentially, they were looking at money spent.
Right.
And they looked at the fact we spend the most on healthcare. We have the biggest pharmaceutical companies. We have the biggest research centers, all of which was true. But it turned out I'm not saying as a result, but it's also true that we were incredibly slow moving. We were incredibly lumbering. We had many miscues. And it wasn't just Trump, by the way. The CDC got the first test wrong. HHS never figured out how to allow the CDC to work with private labs. Then they never figured out a national testing system. And the crucial part we never got right was the isolation of people who were sick. Just to explain this one, because it's such an important point. The key to tackling COVID is not just the testing, not just the tracing. It is the isolation of the sick and the potentially sick. So what Taiwan did was they took anyone who was sick or potentially sick and asked them to quarantine for 14 days. The sum total of all those people was 200,000, 1% of Taiwan's population. But by doing that, by putting those people into a box, you allow the other 99% to never have a day's lockdown. So Taiwan never had a lockdown. South Korea never had a national lockdown. Singapore never had one. Vietnam never had one. Hong Kong never had one. So the key was actually that intelligence, using a scalpel. As the guy who ran the Taiwan program said to me, once you have a lockdown, it means you failed. It means you weren't able to do this intelligent surgical extraction of the sick and potentially sick. And that's how government should work, that ability to be smart, to be lean, to be effective. And I mean, a few places, Denmark, Germany initially, Switzerland, Iceland, Finland, New Zealand managed to do it. But what's striking is how many did not, how many very rich countries were not able to.
Focusing on the UK and the States for a moment. I mean, in the year sort of leading up to COVID, you have obviously, some of the most divided populations in the history of these countries. I'm just curious, how much did the role of just trust alone and the distrust of governments, of leaders, whether it's political, whether it's financial, play into this lack of a coordinated response? I mean, what was it so much as we didn't know what we were doing, or we didn't communicate it well, or frankly, people just didn't want to listen?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. And the way you put it, trust, it sort of gets at something very central. Um, so I think that the part of the book that I didn't spend enough time on, which I'm going to write a final chapter for the paperback edition, is going to be about, there's an element of state failure here, but there's also an element of societal failure. So one of the things you notice in those East Asian countries is people came together as a collective and they said, we're going to deal with this, we're going to tackle this. And it's that collective spirit that allowed them to handle it. Again, some in democracy, some in dictatorships. It was kind of national, unifying project. In a way, the mask is wearing is a good metaphor for this, because the mask actually doesn't protect you very much. It mostly protects the other people. And so what the bargain you're doing, the social contract you enter into when you wear a mask, is to say, I will protect you and you will protect me, and together we protect the community. That was, the places where that was present did really well. The places where that was absent didn't do so well. Sort of high trust, low trust, if you will. And you layer onto it, so in some of that was East Asia doing well because they thought of themselves in more collective terms. We in the West thought of ourselves as more individuals. And this was true even in places like France, where after an initial period of listening, they were, their attitude was, I've had enough, I'm going to the beach. And all the conventions broke down. And that's why you saw this massive second wave in most of Europe. In fact, a wave that was even stronger than the United States. But then there's another element, which, I want to mention briefly, because it's this reality of a class divide that has developed in most Western societies, between a kind of urban, educated, professionally educated, professional elite. One way to think of them is symbolic analysts, people who manipulate words, numbers, images, songs for a living. And then there's the physical analysts, the people who manipulate physical objects for a living. My guess is your company is unique in that you have both within it. And there's a big class divide, and what in some ways, what Trump represents was the resentment of a lot of people who are rural, who are less educated, toward this know-it-all, sushi eating, urban living, yoga doing, group who think that they know the answers to everything, and who have this smug attitude of, so when people would tell them, you have to wear a mask, you have to shut down your business, the way that came across to somebody who was, who was facing, and I used to tell my staff all the time, every time we say something like the lockdown is a good idea, just keep in mind, all of you have your jobs. All of you are generating the same income you're generating. Imagine what it sounds like to somebody who's being told, and you will therefore not have a paycheck next week, right? So that divide became very toxic, particularly in some very divided countries where this problem, this axis, has become very, very strong.
It's funny, you reference him in your book, and I was fortunate. Michael Sandell was the last talk that I did on his book, The Tyranny of Merit, and he calls it the meritocratic elite, and leading to a lot of the distrust. And we saw it in our business, we all saw it in the world. This really was a tale of 2 or 3 or 4 cities where it did feel like that the economic divide that clearly existed, pre-COVID, only got worse as the big companies got bigger and a lot of, financial people did well, while a lot of folks in our plants around the world were dealing with not just the personal tragedy of loss and disease, but the complexity of being in a small room with a lot of kids doing homeschool and, trying to work and things of that sort. It was a very, disturbing reality to witness. And at the same time, I felt like maybe we were all sort of taking a pause and having a newfound recognition for folks that we didn't probably pay attention to in our society in the same way, whether it was the grocery clerk or the FedEx delivery person, or, frankly, those essential workers. Looking forward, the post-pandemic world, is this the big inflection point for us, the wake-up call where people really will reprioritize their agenda, pay attention to the things that hopefully really do matter in life, and maybe have a newfound respect for the dignity of work that Michael talks about, as opposed to just the scoreboard or the market and things of that sort?
Look, I think for many of us who are fortunate enough to have jobs and to maintain the ability to continue to function, I think it did. My guess is for you, and my guess is for most of the people on this call, you have a newfound thoughts about what was really important in your life, what was worth the travel, what was worth the meeting, the certain pleasure and I'm sure the complexity, at least for me, was of having all your kids back. I have a 21-year-old who I thought had flown the coop. I have a 17-year-old who was at boarding school. Suddenly she's back, and I'm reestablishing. I'm creating a new relationship with my children as adults, but in a day-to-day context, in a way that, I thought I was going to see my son every few weeks for a night or two, and that was going to be great. And here we were, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
And it was great, but, it was a learning for everyone involved. But I think that, the larger question you're asking, I don't know about, because here's the fundamental problem. And it's, as you say, what I say in my book is, the COVID accelerated trends already happening. And I use that great Lenin line where he says, there were decades when nothing happened, and then there are weeks when decades happen. So you felt that sense of acceleration. So one of the things that's been happening in our economic system is that symbolic analysts are being overpaid and physical analysts are being underpaid. I'm using over and under. I don't know what the right, you know what I mean by being. There are massive returns to scale for people like us, and on the other hand, classic wage labor, the steel worker, the auto parts maker, have just lost their pricing power. That's one of the reasons you have no inflation in the world. If you want to look at the fundamental reason, we have had 30 years of declining interest rates and declining inflation. It's just fundamentally in rich countries, inflation is a wage-driven phenomenon. And if the vast majority of people have lost their pricing power, and they've lost their pricing power because what they do can either be done by somebody in China or India for 10 cents on the dollar, or it's done by a machine, and they don't even, they're not needed anymore. In that context, just saying that they're essential workers and saying we're going to be nice to them, it won't solve anything. We have to come up with, economics is not going to solve this problem for us. Markets are not going to solve this problem for us. And I say in another one of those chapters, we have to recognize that the market is fantastic at some things, efficiency, productivity, but there are things we want as a society, as a community, as a country that are not going to be provided by the market. And we have to step in. So it's one of the reasons I've become much more comfortable with some state intervention. I grew up in India, a kind of socialist country. I'm very suspicious of government intervention and all that. But you're seeing where the market is leading you, right? The market basically would like us to buy everything from Amazon. The market would, look at what the market has done. There's Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Those 5 companies dominate the digital economy. This would have been John D. Rockefeller's wet dream. And that can't, so the market is telling us that's the efficient solution. We have to ask ourselves, what is the solution that we can live with as human beings?
You reference in the book the FT, making a comment that markets aren't enough, which you talk about, which is a pretty big thing coming from the FT. I'm glad to hear that you think that socialism has been sort of discounted as a viable system. It feels like these debates, though, are still going on clearly in our country. I'd love to talk about the states for a little bit and the role that we have played in the world over the last, call it 50, 70 years and where you see this going. Obviously, post-Cold War, the US was a dominant, sort of agenda setter on the world stage. And you talked about the evolution into a bipolar world or a multipolar world. Can we talk about sort of the influence and the wane of the influence of the states, the rise of China, how the world stage is so changed and likely to be governed differently in the years to come?
Sure. And look, you put it exactly right. For the last 70 years, the United States has been the absolute agenda setter, the leader, the organizer, the architect, but also the lender of last resort, the guarantor of last resort. The currency has been the reserve currency of the world. And I want to be clear, I still believe America remains incredibly vibrant and incredibly vital. I think that people who think that the United States is, in some kind of rapid decline aren't looking out the window. I mean, look at Google, look at Facebook, look at Amazon, look at Tesla, look at SpaceX, look at all these amazing vaccine, and pharmaceutical companies. But there is a real problem, which is that American government is broken. It wasn't just, American power didn't derive just from the strength of the private sector. It derived from the fact that this was the country that beat back fascism, that contained communism, that built the interstate highway system, that put a man on the moon, that invented the internet. That was all done by the United States government. And that sense, I remember talking to Chinese officials in the 1990s. They would come to America and say, tell us how you regulate your financial markets. Tell us how you set up the Federal Reserve System. Tell us that sense that we had a system, as you pointed out with that Johns Hopkins ranking. We had a system that was fundamentally, may have been expensive, but we could afford that. But it was amazing. It was dazzling. Nobody thinks that anymore. And part of that is that American government has really just gotten broken and atrophied. 40 years of Reaganism and Thatcherism. Maybe at its time it was the right thing, but at this point, what has happened? It has defunded, it has demeaned, it has disrespected government, and these agencies just don't function. You can see that. I mean, just think about this. We screwed up the initial response. We screwed up the testing. We screwed up the rollout. Then we screwed up the vaccine rollout. Even after the private sector delivered the vaccine in heroic time, we've screwed up the vaccine. The only thing we've been good at so far has been writing the checks to those private sector companies. We've done that fantastically, and then writing checks to Americans. Those two things the United States got right. The administering of anything, the government has done badly. So you've got to sort that out. But there's a larger dimension and an international one that you correctly point to, which is, for the first time in 70 years, or maybe ever, we face a real peer competitor.
Yeah.
We face a country that is as technologically sophisticated at its highest levels as the United States. People who think that China, I really feel as though people need to go to China more, and they will discover, first of all, one of the most impressive open free markets in the world, in the consumer sector, in the tech sector. There are many parts of the economy that are still government dominated, but 70% of the GDP is private. In quantum computing, in artificial intelligence, in software, they are world class. You also will find a much more pragmatic, flexible approach that has allowed them, for example, in fintech, financial technology, they're way ahead of us. I mean, money clears in 20 seconds in China. It still takes 4 days for a check to clear in the United States, right? So there's a huge area where they're actually moving ahead in 5G right now. If we don't watch it, and we seem like we're going to flub it, they're going to end up with a much faster 5G system than we are, because we're refusing to auction off the mid-band spectrum, which is the sweet spot, because the Pentagon wants to hog that. It's a classic American special interest problem, right? So we're facing those challenges, and the Chinese are saying to the world, look at the challenges you face: pandemics, climate change, all these kinds of system facing problems. The American state buckles, we handle it. The American state is not designed to handle these kind of long-term challenges, but we are. And you know what? This is the challenge. They're not entirely wrong.
You talk a little bit about sort of the role of global institutions and the failure of the League of Nations, for example, as compared to what we have today. Seeing the rise of China, less from a military perspective, but more from an economic and a technological perspective, how inevitable is conflict? What is the role of individual leaders? Premier Xi, how much does he play directly into, the course of events here? And how do you see sort of, Brexit and the European Union and a global, community working to counterbalance this, kind of, two-power system?
So it's fascinating to think about the pandemic in this regard, because you'd think that a pandemic, which by nature is global, I mean, you and I were talking before, this is the most global event any of us have ever lived through. Every human being on the planet is being affected by it, right? In a way that 9/11 never did. I mean, imagine if you were in Japan or in South Africa or in Brazil. 9/11 had basically no effect. You got new X-ray machines at the airports. That was it. The global financial crisis, unless you were part of the Western system of finance, you didn't have credit default swaps and things like that. So you felt the recession, but there was a second order effect. This time, everyone is experiencing this simultaneously. And yet it's caused nations to look inward. It's caused nations to say, how do I protect myself? How do I kind of get my narrow advantage? You see this with even the vaccines, with the vaccine nationalism. So there's a real danger that you go down that path. And of course, the ultimate version of that will be a massive acceleration of the US-China rivalry. Look, at some level, competition is good. If looking at China makes us think we better get our 5G right, we better get our healthcare system right, we better make sure we are innovating, we better make sure our artificial intelligence is world-class. That's great. To a certain extent, the Cold War helped the United States along those lines. But to the extent that we start to, go down a competitive spiral of saying we're going to try to, deny China access to this, thwart this, create two technology ecosystems for the world, create two supply chains for the world, a China and an ex-China. Well, then fundamentally what you're doing is you're breaking down the open global economy upon which for the last 70 years, peace and prosperity has rested, right? If then you're going back to a kind of Cold War orientation, and it's a Cold War which is very different from Cold War I, because Soviet Union was never more than 10 to 12% of global GDP. China is now the second largest economy in the world, is likely to become the largest. Every country in Asia has China as its largest trading partner. So you're going to end up with a very different world in which the two most dynamic societies in the world are going through, races in arms, in space, in cyber hacking, and potentially in physical areas. So I think it's a pretty dangerous world. I think a much better outcome would be for us to have competition with China, to continue to deter them, but also have a lot of areas of cooperation. I mean, frankly, we can't solve climate change without China. We can't solve even the trading system without China. We say that China cheats. True, we cheat a lot too. Every big country has exceptions and carve-outs. Look at the European agricultural subsidies. Look at our agricultural subsidies. They're all basically violations of global free trade principles. And the Chinese have, each one has their own. The Chinese don't subsidize their agriculture, they subsidize their export industry. We used to have these same complaints about Japan. But let's try to do it in the framework of saying, we're trying to preserve this extraordinary creation that came into being after 1945, which is an open system, rules-based, where America has been able to set the agenda, and we've lifted 500-600 million people out of poverty. We haven't had a great power war since 1945. We've managed to adhere to some rules of the road. If you look at 1945, 20% of the world's countries were democratic. Now it's something like 45, 50%. So there's real progress here. And I think my fear is that if we go down a really nasty competitive spiral with the Chinese, it'll be very difficult to maintain any of that.
No, I think that's right. And, I think what I was trying to draw out is, there's been this debate and, the varying, as I said, when we were talking before, competing trends of both globalization and then, nationalism and anti-immigration and things that were going on. This dialogue about reshoring, supply chains and emergency medical supplies, and, sort of almost an anti-global, view, it feels very unrealistic in terms of dealing with the challenges that we're all going to have as a world on a going forward basis, whether, this is likely not our last pandemic, whether it's economic, whether it's climate, whether it's cyber that you talk about. It's almost impossible to erect false borders in lots of these, big issues of the world. And so, I would hope that governments and leaders around the world continue down the path of engagement and dialogue, and a lot of these global institutions almost regain some respect, working away from those, those very scary trends of nationalism and every man for himself.
The odd thing, David, is that what we do with globalization is we pocket the gains.
Yes.
And we angrily protest the costs.
Yeah.
So look at the vaccine. So we're all marveling at this amazing vaccine. I mean, we've got 5 vaccines. Normally, a vaccine for a new disease takes 15 years. This took 9 months. We have 5 amazing vaccines that the efficacy rates are off the charts. Flu vaccine is 70%. We're at 95% with these vaccines. How did it happen? It was all globalization. First of all, the science was totally globalized. The Chinese find the virus and immediately, you get the genome sequenced. The Germans immediately start working on therapies. The Americans immediately start working on vaccines. Everybody is sharing that information on an open platform. Then you get the investment, which is all global. Everybody from around the world funding people. By the way, most of the scientists who did this turned out to be immigrants. The guys in Germany were doing it with Turkish immigrants. The guy who did it in America, the head of Moderna, was an Armenian immigrant. Then you get the production. And the production is completely, everything that everyone was criticizing at the beginning, how all this stuff were dependent on China. 60% of the vaccine is being made in India. The glass vials are all coming from China. The only way we are going to produce 4 billion vaccines in 2 years, which is what is going to happen, is because you have a massive global supply chain that is working at incredible efficiency. So, we want all that. But then, when we see some downside, which is it took a couple of weeks to get enough face masks, we say, oh, it's all because of the Chinese. It's all because of the perfidious, So we've got to, I hope we get mature about it, which is, if you want the gains, there are some costs with it. And by the way, it's pretty easy to keep a medical stockpile of, a few million. These shortfalls were very short periods where you ran out of stuff, because that's the nature of capitalism. Once you tell the market you need this, you have a huge ramp up, but there's going to be a shortfall occasionally. And so maybe that's the simplest thing, is not to switch off globalization and global supply chains, but to just keep some strategic reserves of certain kinds of supply.
Well, I'm hopeful. Shifting gears just a little bit, I love how you talk about sort of, the pandemic unlikely to rewrite history, but more as an accelerator of history. That is unequivocally what we experience in our business. I mean, we're an old school industrial sort of manufacturing company, not a lot of technological disruption in our business for a long time for lots of reasons. And as much as that was a technological hurdle, it was a human cultural hurdle. I mean, people couldn't conceive of changing the way that they did business until, frankly, they had no choice. So all of a sudden, we're talking, we used to sell roofing with literally cardboard, sheets with, shingles stapled to them. And now we've got VR goggles and drones over the house and iPads and all this fancy stuff. And what we've seen is the uptake really be something we never would have seen outside of a forcing mechanism like this, pandemic. Talk a little bit about what you think will stick and what you think won't stick in the way we've all lived over the last year. I love your reference to Ian Forster's The Machine Stops. It definitely feels like we've been living in some strange world. Work from home, travel. What are the trends that you think will stick from this, and what are the things that we're all going to rush to get back to as soon as we can?
So it will definitely not be like the world after the great influenza of 1918. Because if you think about it, right after the great influenza, what did you have? You had the roaring 20s. You had the jazz age. You had 1,000 speakeasies in New York which, by the way, was in a time of prohibition. Imagine how many
This is
bars
not
they
the
would
answer. This is not the answer I'm looking for. I would love it to be the Roaring Twenties.
So you're not going to see that. And the reason is because we have this new thing called the digital age, and with the digital economy. And as you put it right, I mean, we had this massive forced testing where people who were the best place you see it is probably not even in your business, but in telehealth. People were very reluctant to go to doctors online. They felt like it was really important to have that personal, intimate conversation. And secondly, the doctors were very reluctant because they didn't get paid.
Yeah.
And suddenly the pandemic broke both barriers. It broke the psychological barrier for the patient, but it broke the practical barrier for the doctor, because Medicare said, we'll pay, we'll reimburse you for televisits. And now we've had 1 billion telehealth visits, which is where people thought we'd be in 2035. So it's an acceleration of almost 15 years. So the real question is going to be, what is it going to look like going forward with regard to this hybrid life that we are going to construct? I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think we're going to go through trial and error, and people are going to try to figure out what it looks like. But here's the best sense I have, which is the biggest trend in modern human history is urbanization.
Right.
If you look over the last 250 years, the single trend you see that is most dramatic in demographic terms is declining births, family sizes, and rising urbanization. Those are the two trends. And rising urbanization is happening everywhere. You're going to add many of those mega cities in Asia, but it's happening in the United States, it's happening in France, it's happening. It's part of the reason for the politics we've been talking about. I'm sure you guys have all seen those graphs of who voted for Biden and who voted for Trump. And you see that Biden's vote, which is 80 million or 81 million people, comes from basically from about 5% of the landmass of the United States, whereas Trump's 73 million votes comes from about 95% of the landmass. Now, let me remind you, Trump's vote is older. They're demographically declining, right? So that same number that I told you was even more true for Hillary. In other words, this is a trend that keeps you're seeing more and more urbanization. So, and that's for a simple reason. You make more money if you live in a city. But what a city means, I think, is going to be redefined. And I think here we're going back to the future. The modern office building is a 19th century creation. It's basically patterned on a factory. The idea is we all get up at the same time and we leave our home and we go to this big rectangular building. In a factory, it used to be laid flat. An office tower is laid upright, but it's the same idea. And you work with everybody else. You have meals at the same time as everybody else. And then you leave that rectangular building and you go home. That's a very unusual way of thinking about it. If you look at human history, even industrial history, for the 200 years before that, I mean, the farmer lived on his farm. The tradesman lived in his house. The artisan would often do his artisanship in a room in the house or in the garage. The shopkeeper lived above the store. The dentist would often have his dentist's office in the basement. We may be going back to that life, a world in which home and work is all mixed up. And so there will be offices for sure. They'll probably be quite large, but they may look a lot like the WeWork office, in that the dedicated space for every human being, in which he can put up his family photos and keep, that may go away, because if you think about it, it's an incredibly inefficient way to maintain things. You maybe we'll all become more like the WeWork office or like consulting firms, which already do this. In a sense, you rent the office when you need it and you leave. And since everything is on the cloud, that can, so what does that do? It may shrink the size of those offices. Midtown might look very different. You might take some of those buildings and turn them into residences. People may spend more time in the suburbs. By the way, when I say a city, I mean a metro area. Right. A metro area will thrive, but where people will live in that metro area may change. And I don't pretend to be a prophet about it. All I'm saying is, I think we're going to go through a period of trial and error, and the result will be some hybrid version. But let me give you a final thought on why I think it's not going to be as easy to predict. There are huge advantages to all this digital stuff we're doing, but there are disadvantages. integrating new people, hiring new people. We're spending a lot of social capital. We're not building a lot of social capital. People need that sense of reassurance, those intangible values. When you're making that first sales call to a new customer to establish that bond, are you going to do it on Zoom, or are you going to do it in person? And are you going to do it in person because you're worried that your competitor might do it in person? That dynamic might play itself out. For a conference, you might do one where it's all your direct reports, you know each other, it's a retreat, you were going to go to a crappy hotel, in Maine. That one you might do on Zoom. But the big event where you're trying to make sure your clients are having a nice time, where it's a little bit of drama and glamour, that you might still do in Vegas, right? So I think it's all going to look a little bit like that. And my final thought is, think about education. We all have had kids in online. We all know it's suboptimal. Some parts of it work, a lot of it doesn't. It sort of took a lot of the fun out of education for kids, which was the social interaction, the flirting with the girls or the boys, the making fun of the teacher, the class, the hallway interactions, and all you were left with was the educational monologue from the teacher. And that was clearly not enough. So that's a good way to think about how would you reincorporate, if you were to think about these things, how do you take not just the best parts of the Zoom experience, but how would you remedy for the worst parts of the Zoom experience?
Yeah, well, you're preaching the choir on this one. I mean, I think, this is not a light switch. We're not all going to stay at home, 24/7 forever, but we are likely to experience a much different, more flexible workplace. But, one of the things that I think has made this as functional as it's been over the last year, the digital working, is the fact that we had these pre-existing relationships. We had that social capital built up that you talk about. We had the trust, and we spent a lot of it. And it's time to, when we can get back together and start building it again. I'm sensitive to time because I know we've got a set of questions that people have for you, and I don't want to monopolize because I could do this forever with you. But I do want to end my part with how you end the book. A lot of scary stuff in the world right now. This is likely not our last health crisis. You have the rise of China that we talked about, social, economic inequality, cyber, climate, all these things. Where's human agency, the role of individuals and leaders, and how do we weigh that dynamic with what feels like very large, inevitable forces? I love to be optimistic and hope that the role of human agency is our likely saving grace.
Here's the fundamental reason I'm optimistic. You never change without a crisis. You never change without, unless your back's to the wall. Perfect metaphor in this circumstance, you never fix the roof when the sun is shining, right? And so what this pandemic has done is it's already disoriented us. It's thrown everything up in the air. Life is already weird and abnormal. We're already experiencing massive disruption. We're already, have let go of certain taboos. The government is already spending a lot of money. So now the question becomes, what do we really want to do? I mean, if we can spend the money, how would we spend it well? If we are going to change our normal arrangements, how should we do them best? And one of the things I hope could come out of this would be the digitization of government. Yeah. Why couldn't, so much of what government does could be done online in a way that'd be so much more efficient. Jury selection, stuff like that, where you have people stand in queues and lines unendingly. Think of your experience of the DMV, all those things, and those are little things, but it's a way of thinking big, of saying, why don't we take, the fact that everything has been disruptive and do zero-based accounting, as it were, and say, given that it's all up in the air anyway, how would you construct this from scratch? So I think that is going to happen, and it's going to happen in a bunch of countries, and maybe I hope some of it will happen in a bunch of states in America. This is where the bottom-up period experience is very good. It wasn't so great for public health to have all these varying state standards, but from this point of view, it could be actually very useful. And I think that ultimately, one of the things that makes me hopeful about the world and about America is people are searching, people are searching for a way to make things work better. There is a lot of discontent, but that discontent is because we recognize that we could do better. We recognize that this is not a system working for everyone. And in America, what gives me a lot of hope is, we wash our dirty linen in public much more than other countries. I often tell people, don't think China doesn't have any problems. It's just, if you talk about the problems in China, you'd be in jail, right? I mean, they do a lot of things right, but they do a lot of things wrong. But by the way, we talk about it endlessly. But that's great. This is we now have a time. We now have a chance to actually make something of that and say, let's take these ideas, let's take those discontents, and let's figure out how to make it work better. And I do. It's not just that I hope things will be better. I'm pretty confident that the United States is very energetic, very dynamic. The fact that we have immigrants makes such a difference because we have that new energy pulsing through the system. I think we're going to come out of this better.
Well, listen, I love the optimism. I share the hopeful thoughts. And I too believe that this is a forcing mechanism for sure, but one that will hopefully allow us all to reprioritize, how we live our lives, what we think is important, and what we hold in high esteem. So from your lips, I'm a believer. I want to turn to the questions. Some were submitted and some are coming in live because sensitive to time. The first question we have here is, what advice would you give the new administration as we look ahead to the post-pandemic America?
I think the administration has actually got its basic priorities right, which is, deal with COVID first. They're first trying to massively accelerate the vaccine rollout. They've done pretty well. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, when they came in, 8% of elderly Americans were vaccinated. I think as of yesterday, 50% of elderly Americans have had at least one vaccine shot. And a lot of that is just simple stuff like, the White House getting very energetically behind. The American government was designed not to work. We created a government that was meant to prevent tyranny, and it's very good at making sure nothing happens. So it takes Herculean efforts to make stuff happen, and they're doing that. The second is, I do think you've got to spend generously right now, because think about it this way: this is not about stimulus. This is the government of the United States telling people that you cannot transact economic activities, you cannot do business, you cannot stay open. And for people, the hit is very substantial. I know you guys were an essential business, but for millions and millions of others, it was not. You've got to step in there. And you've got to make those people whole, and you've got to give them hope. And then I do think you need to build back better. I mean, I realize I'm talking in cliches, but we are so badly off in infrastructure.
Yeah.
This is one of the worst disinvestments that we have done over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think we forget how important it was. Why did Silicon Valley come up? Silicon Valley came up because the state of California had the greatest K through PhD state university system in the world. It had the most amazing highway system. It had the greatest public parks, which attracted scores of people to go out west. The weather obviously helped. And then you had massive government contractors for Defense Department engineers, right? Or Lockheed Martin, all that stuff. So it's not magic that creates these things, but we have been eating the seed corn of that investment. And we need to make those investments at every level, at infrastructure, at R&D, at technology. So again, if we are feeling psychologically like we can open up the purse strings, I think that with interest rates where they are now, this is the absolutely golden moment to do it. So I think they're doing all that right. I think that in international terms, they're trying to keep the world at bay as far as I can tell. They're punting on a lot of stuff. They're trying to show that they're tough on China and Iran so that they don't get outflanked by the Republicans. I worry a little when you play that game, often you lose because you're conceding the terms of the debate. But by and large, I think they're handling the early days well.
Yeah, well, just to the infrastructure point, I mean, we are very, very focused and big believers that it's not just infrastructure that's required, which it is by all stretch, but it's more industrial technology broadly. I mean, if you think about the billions and billions and billions of dollars that have gone into apps that will deliver a burrito to you on any corner in the world, as compared to the built and physical environment, I mean, it's really terrifying. And we think there's a real secular shift coming with a much bigger focus on industrial technology, the built environment, the cities of the future, transportation, things of that sort. So government will play a huge role in that. The next question is many have drawn parallels between the pandemic and the Spanish flu and have remarked on the roaring 20s and the jazz age that followed. Do you think we're headed for the roaring 20s? I won't make you answer that again because I know we touched on it in our talk, but maybe I'll ask it this way, which is, how likely are we to come back to a version of life that we all recognize in the fall? When are we going back into theaters? When are we going back to concert halls and museums and going into restaurants without fear? Is this sooner than we think, or do we have to get used to a new normal?
I think the truth is it's going to be a very staggered, complicated, messy process. I think, think about, just imagine it, and I think you'll understand what I'm saying, which is people are going to try some things. Right. Some of them are going to work. Some of them are not. Germans are, for example, trying concert music. Why? Because nobody screams and yells and shouts in a classical music concert. They're all facing in the same direction. If they wear masks, there's not a lot of danger. And maybe you end up with alternate seating or something like that. So you start out with things like that. But I think that, fundamentally, we are going to be for a while living in this gray zone, because there's going to be variants, because not everyone will be vaccinated, because some part of the population will still be scared no matter what, for rightly or wrongly. And I think that, we're going to learn as we go along. There's not going to be a moment where we say the pandemic is over. Right. The area where there is a similarity to the Roaring 20s is we're all desperate to go, to do some stuff. And that pent up feeling will show up, I believe, in some areas, in going to restaurants, in shopping, there is a certain amount of pent up demand that is going to bubble over. I think if I knew exactly where that would bubble into, I would be, I'd be investing in it, and I wouldn't be wasting my time talking to anyone and just be holed up. But I don't think we know for sure. But I think we all sense it in ourselves that there is a certain amount of pent up demand waiting to be let out. And, one of the things about the government writing these checks is people's personal balance sheets are better than they've been in 35 years.
Well, I promise you there's pent up demand here, so I agree. Yeah, I think we probably have time for a couple more. Our next question is, what keeps you up at night? I'm sure there's more than a few things. What worries you the most about the world? And maybe I'll focus the question a little bit on two topics that are large topics, and I know we don't have too much time, but feel very much like the next set of crises. One is climate. Clearly, this is not a future issue. This is a current issue. How much has this pandemic sort of peeled back or exposed the true climate crisis that we have? And do you think that this will be paid to? I mean, obviously the ESG trends in corporates and the financial markets are huge right now. Is this a secular shift? Finally, we're all coming to terms with the existential climate crisis that we all face?
I don't know. I wish I could tell you that we were, because the nature of pandemic is, okay, people don't think about it at all. But finally, when you've had this thing hit, it's gotten our attention. Now, God knows, we'll all spend a lot on global health and preparedness. Right. But with climate, it's incremental. It's like the old story of the frog in the boiling water, which, by the way, apparently scientists tell me is not true. The frog actually will jump out of the water if the water keeps slowly getting hotter. But the danger is that metaphor, which is that we're not recognizing that there seems to be something weird going on, because, in last year, 2020, 5 million acres of land burned to the ground in the United States. That is the state of Massachusetts burning to the ground. The storms in 2019 cost $270 billion to repair, the 3 hurricanes. You look at what's happening in Texas, but it doesn't seem to get us to the point where we understand that we've got to deal with the fundamental cause. Bill Gates has this new book out where he says, it's all across the economy that you have these, carbon is being released when you make cement, when you make steel. So to me, the simplest solution is to put a carbon tax, to say that, because otherwise you need 100 different government programs that are dealing with 100 different things. But instead, if you say anything that releases greenhouse gases into the earth is not fully accounting for the external costs. And one thing government does very well, the thing that you tax, you get less of, the thing that you subsidize, you get more of.
Yeah.
So I would like to put a low carbon tax on all carbon emissions and take that money and fund breakthrough technologies and fund the hard stuff. This is where Gates is right. Don't fund electric cars. The market is funding that.
Yeah.
Fund non-carbon based cement,
yeah.
Steel, the stuff that is very hard to do right now, and figure out how to do. And he's doing a lot of it, by the way, an extraordinary guy. I mean, he's funding a company that, I don't know if you guys know about this, where they take CO2 that's produced out of cement manufacturing and they put it back into the cement.
Yes.
And it gets sealed into the cement. Right now, they're doing 5% capture. They hope to be in the next generation model, they'll be at 30% capture, and then it's 70% capture. So
True.
That's what we need. We need much more of that breakthrough technology, because without innovation, we're not going to do anything. I mean, the world currently, 80% of world and global energy use is fossil fuels.
Sure.
80%. You know what it was 40 years ago? 80%. Yeah. We need something. We need some big breakthroughs here.
I mean, I haven't read his book yet, but I know he talks about green premiums and similar market-based concepts. And we're very, personally and from a professional perspective, we're very, very focused on sustainable energy. Rooftop solar is a huge effort for us. Inside GAF, we have an aggregates business, and it's amazing. We have outdoor quarries, mining. And our waste product forever was dust, effectively. I have a lot of bad jokes, but I used to say we turned big rock into little rock better than anybody else. But we had a ton of dust. It was a climate issue because it was a life of mine issue. You had to put the dust somewhere, never mind an economic issue, and have this R&D project trying to utilize it in a soil amendment for carbon sequestration. Actually takes carbon out of the climate. Now it's small right now in its effectiveness, but there are real technologies, as you say. Whether it's distributed energy and solar roofing, or it's wind and carbon sequestration broadly speaking. But I'm fearful that none of this will actually take on the scale required without government. And that's back to our government conversation about markets are not enough. And I know, Bill Gates, focus on green premiums and carbon credits, and we have to create markets of scale, but you need real government intervention on a global basis to effectuate a different outcome here.
And I think the key is you have to allow government to fail.
Yes.
If you have to think of government in this regard a little bit like a venture capital firm. So the government made two $700 million loans in 2011, I think it was. One was to Tesla, one was to Solyndra. You remember Solyndra, the solar company?
I remember that. I visited them. I remember them well.
Right. So everybody knows about the loan to Solyndra. It became the most famous bad loan the government made.
Yeah.
What few people remember, there was a loan of about the same size to Solyndra. Now, to Tesla. Tesla repaid the loan. Imagine if the federal government had taken equity instead, right? But that's not how the government works. The government says the upside is for you in the private sector. We will take the downside. If the loan gets written up, and that's probably how it should be, but we need to be much more willing to allow government to fail in those kind of experimental ventures.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're out of time. I got to tell you what an honor and a treat this was for me to be able to spend this time with you. And I know how much everybody else online with us has enjoyed this. So thank you so much for taking the time. And I encourage everybody to read this. It really is fantastic in its breadth and digestible in its narrative. So please go get the book. Thank you so much, Fareed.
My pleasure, David. And thank you for having me. And, this is, by the way, a wonderful example of how you're using technology to do something really interesting for the company that maybe would have been a little more difficult to do without. So, we're seeing the benefits of all this, and let's just keep going with them.
Fantastic. Good to see you.
Take care.